Hey there and welcome back to another Pixar video. And as you may know, if you're an avid fan of Pixar, or just Disney in general I guess, you would probably have heard that recently we saw the release of Pixar's latest feature film on Disney+, Turning Red, which tells the story of Maylin Lee, a 13-year-old girl who finds herself blessed with the power to turn into a giant panda and the trouble that ability causes as she tries to navigate the life of a young teen in the early 2000s, dealing with friendships and boys, overbearing family, bullying, and boy bands. So really, it sounded like a pretty solid premise, but I don't think I was really all that sold coming into it. I was excited, like I usually am when it comes to Pixar films, but it was layered with a certain sense of apprehension. I wasn't expecting it to be a terrible film, but on the other hand, I didn't expect for it to wow me all that much. And so, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised by what I saw, because in that first 20 minutes especially, the film really came out swinging and tried its hardest to set itself apart from a lot of the other works that Pixar's made previously. And I think that it did that quite successfully. And there was a lot to like about the film, even if it did drag on in parts and probably could have been a little bit shorter and more streamlined. But that being said, it was still a very enjoyable experience and was a very good effort on Pixar's behalf. Nothing to be ashamed of there. And I mean, it has a pretty good rating on Rotten Tomatoes. 95% fresh is nothing to sniff at after all. And whilst Pixar seems to be getting screwed out of getting proper theatrical releases at the moment, I have a suspicion it would have done decently well at the box office too. Pixar usually does after all. So, in my opinion, it was an overwhelming success. So, when I heard that a fairly large subsection of fans did not like the film, I was pretty surprised if I'm being honest with you. A 69% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes? Barely fresh? And a ton of discussion on social media and other review sites talking about how this is a bad film. And I'm just here thinking, did we watch the same movie? But you know, I can recognize that different people have different tastes. I get it. Not everybody wants to see the same things as another person. But there's one bit of discourse from all of this that's been a very common thing to see in discussions about the film. And that sentiment is that it is not a true Pixar film. And often, that is literally the only justification that people have for disliking it, because it doesn't fit in with their own self-defined narrow parameter of what a Pixar film should be like. And hell, I hate telling people that they're wrong, and so I'm not, but I will say this. People need to cut down with the elitist bullshit when it comes to talking about Pixar. Seriously, the way people hold up some of these films to such an impossible standard, and the way in which the diehards react to any sort of deviation from their own set norm, really reminds me of hardcore Bible thumpers who interpret the Bible literally, with any attempt to deviate or infer something different met with vitriol and judgment. Honestly, to me it's gone to the point where it actually feels insane. Like, I can't tell you how many people I've seen say that it reminds them of a Disney animation film, or a DreamWorks film, or an Illumination film. But I guarantee if those studios made this exact film exactly the same way, they'd say things like, "Oh, Illumination's really lifted their game with this film, best film since Despicable Me, etc, etc. It's simply all about the perspective they're looking at it from. But now, with my position made abundantly clear, I want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the prevalent attitudes that surround this film and why people continue parroting the notion that it isn't a true Pixar film. Now, one of the big things I've seen passed around is that the animation style is wrong. That it doesn't suit Pixar, that it looks too different from a lot of Pixar's other works. And I'll be real, this one bugs me so much. Because for starters, visual style is one of those things in animation that I think is completely subjective as to whether it's good or bad. Yes, I think most people are able to tell when something lacks polish or is obviously made more cheaply, but that isn't the problem here. The animation quality is good, but it's more the design choice that many people seem to take issue with. And no one seems to understand that what some people like, others will not like. Some people love that stereotypical anime look. Some people like the vintage early 1900s black and white style. Some like Golden Age Disney. Some like more modern 2D styles. Some people like hyper-realistic CGI. Some people like mainstream 3D. It's all about preference. And that's why it's so odd to me to see the stylistic choice this film made lambasted so hard. And I mean, the criticism's never, "Oh, I didn't like the style they chose." It's always presented as, the style they went with is bad, and so the film is bad. It's no longer framed as a subjective opinion about how the film looks, but as objective fact that everyone has to believe. And that's what really bothers me. But then this leads me into the second half of my gripe with this sort of criticism. The belief that since it looks a little bit different visually than a number of other Pixar films, that means it no longer feels like a Pixar film. And to me, this feels like such a weird hill to die on. And honestly, I've seen it a lot in the past few years, particularly in this film, but also previously with Onward. People look at the animation, and they just go out with this blanket statement of, oh yeah, that doesn't look like Pixar. Not a true Pixar film. But what does that even mean? Is Pixar supposed to stay stagnant forever, never trying new things? Are they expected to never change at all? Because it certainly seems that way from the outside looking in. Any sort of visual shift these days gets ripped to shreds. It looks too Disney, it looks too DreamWorks, it looks too Illumination. And it's not like those films look bad, so I don't get what the problem is. Is the idea of Pixar having a uniform animation style so firmly ingrained into your sense of childhood nostalgia that any deviation at all from that formula makes you angry? If so, perhaps it is time to lose those rose-tinted goggles. Because look at the early Pixar films of the 90s, and then those of the late 2000s, and then again to the 2010s, etc, etc. Hell, compare Toy Story 1 to Soul. They are hugely different in design. Pixar evolves. They change over time, add new things, try new styles. And yes, they do hold on to certain visual motifs. But you can see those linking elements in Turning Red, in my opinion. But the whole point of this is that they are not a stagnant company. Shit, I mean, part of Pixar's early charm was that they were willing to try new things, whilst other studios seem to have run stale both visually and narratively. But now there's this desire to hold them back from being the innovator again? This desire to have Pixar never move on, never change, to hold on to that feeling of nostalgia? I mean, the way that people talk about this film, and Pixar in general, honestly reminds me of elitist Hollywood snobs who only shoot on film with practical effects exclusively, complaining about CGI and the different visual mediums of blockbusters today. Like they don't want things to advance and they yearn for a bygone era. And I just disagree with that mindset. And this brings me to the story itself. Now, Turning Red tells the story of May, a girl who wakes up one day to find she can transform into a red panda. Chaos then ensues. And honestly, this is a pretty solid plot synopsis. But it's almost like many people choose to not look past the plot description either. Because I've seen hordes of commenters talking about how this film's plot is surface level, that it isn't deep enough for a Pixar film, that it's a silly story. And this one I legit cannot understand. I mean, when you boil down so many other Pixar films, their stories also seem stupid and silly. Toys come to life and move house. Ants fight grasshoppers. Monsters scare children as their career path. A rat learns to cook. A robot falls in love. A man gets rid of his childhood toys and goes to college. A fish gets lost. A different fish gets lost. A sea monster wants to be a real boy. And I'm guessing some of those dismissive and bare-bones descriptions might have got you a little bit annoyed. How dare I simplify those plots down like that? After all, Pixar films have deep and meaningful stories. They're more than skin deep. The Toy Story quadrilogy, a tale of growing up and moving on. Soul, accepting death and treasuring life while you have it. Finding Nemo, accepting that your child's getting older and that you need to give them room to grow past you. In general, we accept that if you look deeper than just the plot itself, you can see that the majority of Pixar films have a very multi-layered story. A film for both children with the visuals and the excitement and the jokes, whilst also having that emotional connection for adults as well. And I don't see how Turning Red lacks this at all. Yes, on the surface it has the silly characters and the boy bands and the fluffy red panda, but ultimately, it's a story about overcoming generational trauma and accepting parts of your heritage that have been left by the wayside by generations past, whilst also telling the story of letting go of the codependent relationship between a mother and a child as the child reaches puberty and starts to grow and change. But people see the panda, or they see the goofy characters and dialogue, and I feel like it sets them against the story from the get-go. And I get it if people simply don't like it, that's fine. But it's the idea that it's somehow not a Pixar film and has a really basic plot that really gets on my nerves, because it doesn't. Is it as complex or layered as many other Pixar films? Realistically, no, it's probably not. Is it as good as other Pixar films? Well, it depends on the film, but it does not ascend to that top tier of storytelling that they've reached before, no. But does that make it a bad film? I definitely argue that it doesn't, because it's not a bad film, at least in my eyes. But once again, I feel like we're seeing what happens when people start to mythologize a certain company for the product they've created. Anytime that company tries to diverge in a new direction or try something different, people seem to take it as a personal attack. And it's the same thing here. It's almost like people feel awkward about liking animated films, and so they latch onto the art house aspect of Pixar, the complex plot and the layered storytelling. And when the narrative diverges from that, or perhaps is presented a little bit differently, or is merely good instead of great, it feels like the end of the world. Because it feels like an attack on your nostalgia and invalidates you watching a kids' film. And I think that's overall what bothers me the most. That we've gotten to the point where Pixar can't win unless they churn out films that look similar and feel similar to all the others they've made before. They aren't allowed to take risks or try new things anymore, because otherwise they get told they're not making Pixar films properly. And that makes me sad. But anyway, these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of Turning Red? Think the hate's overblown, or do you think they have a point? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.